The last ride, a biker's final mission. They say every legend dies twice. First when the man stops believing in himself, then when the town forgets his name. Mike the Wolf Edwards was about to prove them wrong, but nobody knew it yet not. Even him. The rusty bell above Murphy's diner hadn't rung in 20 years. Not until that October morning when a shadow fell across the cracked linoleum, and every conversation died mid-sentence. The leather boots, worn but purposeful, belonged to a ghost most folks thought was 6 feet under. The waitress dropped her coffee pot, sending ceramic shards across the floor like fragments of the past. Finally breaking free, Mike Edwards wasn't supposed to be standing there. Hell, he wasn't supposed to be anywhere once. This town knew his name like a prayer and feared it like a curse. The wolf had been their king, their rebel, their conscience wrapped in chrome and defiance. His motorcycle gang, the Desert Wolves, had ruled these streets with an iron fist and a code of honor that meant something in a world gone soft. But that was before the betrayals, before the losses, before the night that changed everything and sent him disappearing into the desert. Wind like smoke from a dying fire, the townspeople remembered that night. How could they forget? 3 men dead, 2 families destroyed, and the most feared biker in 3 counties vanishing without a trace. Some said he'd died in the desert. Others whispered he'd gone to prison under a false name. The smartest ones knew better. They knew the wolf had simply chosen to disappear because staying would have meant more blood, more pain, more destruction. Now, 20 years later, he was back. And everyone wondered the same thing. Why now? What could possibly bring a dead man back to life? The answer lay in the folded letter tucked inside his weathered leather jacket, a final message from someone who'd been dead for a decade. Somehow, finding its way to his door last Tuesday. The envelope bore no return address, no postmark, just his name written in a hand he'd recognize anywhere. Inside, 3 words that had haunted him since. It's not finished. Sarah's handwriting. Sarah's words. Sarah's ghost reaching out from beyond the grave to drag him back to the place he'd sworn never to see again. Mike walked to his old Harley, parked outside Murphy's like it had been waiting for him all these years. The chrome was duller now, the paint chipped and faded, but the engine still growled with the same fierce pride that had made it legendary. As he kicked it to life, the sound split the morning silence and awakened memories the town had tried to bury in 20 years of careful forgetting. Old-timers stepped onto their porches, recognizing that distinctive rumble. Young folks pulled out their phones, sensing something historic was about to unfold. But Mike wasn't riding for glory anymore. This wasn't about reclaiming his crown or settling old scores. This was about completing something that should have been finished too. Decades ago, something that had cost him everything he'd ever loved. The road stretched ahead like a promise and a threat. Every mile marker held a memory. The bend where Johnny had died, skidding off his bike at 90 miles per hour while running from state police. The bridge where Sarah had said goodbye, tears streaming down her face as she begged him to choose between her and the Brotherhood. The crossroads where he'd made the choice that destroyed everything, picking loyalty over love and watching his world crumble in the rearview mirror. The weight of the past pressed down on him like the desert sun, relentless and unforgiving. Each mile brought him closer to the truth he'd been running from, the reality that some mistakes can't be undone, only confronted. The wind whipped through his graying hair, carrying with it the ghosts of conversations never finished, apologies never spoken. and a love that had died because he'd been too proud to surrender. His destination wasn't far, just outside town, where the old warehouse stood, the place where it all began and where it would finally end. The same place where his former brothers had gathered, waiting for him like they'd been waiting for 20 years. Some had grown old, some had grown bitter, but all of them remembered what had been left unfinished that terrible night when brotherhood turned to betrayal and honor became a lie. Marcus Steele Rodriguez stood in the shadows, his scarred face barely visible under the brim of his weathered hat. Time had been cruel to him, but not as cruel as the guilt that had eaten away at his soul for 2 decades. Next to him, Tommy Chains Morrison gripped his wrench like a weapon, his knuckles white with tension and old rage. They'd all heard the rumors, seen the signs. The wolf was coming home, and with him, the reckoning they'd all been dreading. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. Mike pulled up to the warehouse as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky blood red, like an omen of what was to come. The silence was deafening as he killed the engine and removed his helmet. His hair was grayer. Now, his face lined with years of regret and hard-earned wisdom. But his eyes still held that same fierce determination that had made him a legend and a curse. "You came," Marcus said, stepping into the dying light. "I gave my word," Mike replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Even if it took me 20 years to honor it, what happened next would be whispered about for generations." Not because of the violence, there was surprisingly little of that, but because of what it represented. The end of an era, the closing of a circle, the moment when a man stopped running from his past and finally embraced it, scars and all. The truth came out slowly, like blood from a wound. The real story of what happened that night 20 years ago. Why Mike had disappeared. Why the Brotherhood had scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Why some secrets are worth dying for, and others are worth living for. The warehouse walls echoed with confessions, accusations, and finally, forgiveness. As dawn broke over the desert, Mike stood alone among the ruins of his old life. His former brothers had gone their separate ways, some to make peace with their families, others to find their own redemption in whatever way they could. The letter that had brought him back was ash on the wind. Its message finally delivered, its purpose fulfilled. The town would remember this day differently than the others. Not as the return of a dangerous man, but as the homecoming of a broken soul who'd found his way back to wholeness. The wolf had completed his final mission, and in doing so, had earned something more valuable than fear or respect. He'd earned his peace. Mike mounted his Harley one last time, but this ride was different. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He was riding towards something newer, future he'd never dared to imagine, a life he'd never thought he deserved. The engine's roar carried with it the end of a legend and the beginning of a man who'd finally learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't conquering your enemies, it's conquering yourself. At the town cemetery, he stopped one final time. Sarah's headstone stood weathered but dignified, her name etched in granite like the love he'd carried for 20 years. He placed the burned letter fragments at the base, whispering words that should have been spoken decades ago. "It's finished. Now, darling, we can both rest." The highway stretched before him, endless and full of possibility. Behind him, the town settled back into its rhythm, forever changed by the return of a legend who taught them that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to seek it. Some stories end with a bang, others end with a whisper. Mike Edward's story ended with the sound of a motorcycle fading into the distance, leaving behind only the memory of a man who'd found his way home.